this meeting to order. Welcome to the 71st meeting of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23rd, 2022. Members may participate in person and via Zoom. Proceedings will be published on the House of Commons website. For your information, the web broadcast will always show the person speaking rather than a view of the whole committee. I would also like to acknowledge that our meeting today is taking place on the unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. Do you want me to dispense or keep going? Dispense? Okay, perfect. Excellent. All right. Just a reminder, all comments should be directed through the chair and speak slowly and clearly because we have 3 languages being interpreted. So today in the first section, we have a number of witnesses in person and on Zoom. And I will introduce from the First Nation Lands Advisory Board, we have Philip Goulet and Andrew Bynan, the Director of Land Code Governance, First Nation Land Management. We have the Lower Similkaming Indian Band, and we have the Métis Nation of Alberta joining us as well. So why don't we start with the First Nations Land Advisory Board? I don't know if it's, which one is going, Mr. Goulet. Okay, thank you very much. You have 5 minutes.
Miigwech. Anin Kanawea. Hello, everyone. Miigwech. Thank you for the invitation to speak to this committee as we meet on the traditional lands of the Algonquin. My name is Phil Goulet, and I am a proud member of the Nipissing First Nation and the former chief of Nipissing First Nation. And I have the privilege to serve as an elected director of the Lands Advisory Board for many years. I am here this afternoon to offer recommendations of the Lands Advisory Board on the issue of restitution of land to First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. I'm accompanied by my friend Andrew Bynan, the Director of Lands Governance at the First Nation Land Management Resource Centre. In our written submission, we have briefly commented on the history which has created the restitution of First Nation lands issue, and we offer our recommendations on a better way forward. I would start by noting a bit of discomfort with the term restitution of lands, which suggests that we lost touch with our lands and that the Crown is trying to figure out how to give lands back. We never lost touch with our lands. Nipissing, including myself, continue to practice our hunting, fishing, and cultural traditions, despite all the many challenges of the past relationships with the Crown. Canada and Ontario never managed to take this away. I commend the committee for tackling the important issue of First Nations lands in Canada. I also want the committee to know that Nipissing, along with so many other First Nations in the 20th century, faced very real example of the Crown recognizing our land rights, then taking them away, and then going through incredible delays to recognize our land rights again. For example, Nipissing's land surrender and recovery of lands. Archaeologists suggest that there is evidence of occupation of our lands for about 9,000 years. Nipissing was one of the nations signatory to the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. Later, lands were set aside, and Nipissing reserved in the late 1800s, and in the early 20th century, Nipissing was pressed to surrender reserve lands for timber harvest, railway lands, and the like. These were not surrenders taken at the request of Nipissing, but instead driven by Ontario and the federal government. In one case, land surrendered in 1907 remained unsold after failed land auctions in 1919. The lands came under the jurisdiction of the province of Ontario under the 1924 Land Agreement. Nipissing Nation retained an underlying interest in the lands. After going under provincial jurisdiction, the lands remained in limbo. Neither the federal nor the provincial governments exercised jurisdiction other than to allow for easements and right-of-ways to cross the lands. Ontario did not exercise jurisdiction because they were not responsible for Native affairs. Canada did not exercise jurisdiction because it was waiting for Ontario to transfer the lands back to federal control. In 1963, Nipissing requested that the lands return to Nipissing. 4 parcels of land were transferred to reserve status in 1968. After that, both governments continued the state of limbo without regard to the lands, claiming that no legislation covered the return of unsold, surrendered land back to reserve status. In 1986, the Indian Land Agreement in Ontario provided a mechanism to allow for the repatriation of unsold, surrendered lands to its former owners. Negotiations were restarted on the return of the unsold lands to Nipissing, leading to a 1995 specific agreement between Nipissing Nation, Canada, and the province of Ontario. Orders in council to finalize the transition of the lands to reserve status were completed by the province of Ontario in 2009, 34 years after the Premier of Ontario promised to transfer unsold surrendered lands to Canada. As of this morning, we still don't have Canada's order in council. More recently, we have pursued other additions to reserve that have taken a quarter of a century or more to complete. ATR policies sought by Lands Advisory Board will take years to complete, cost us greatly in terms of staff time and delays, or perhaps even cause us to lose out on economic opportunities. This despite the fact that Nipissing is one of the earliest to have signed onto the framework agreement and to govern our land successfully under our land code. Lands Advisory Board recommendations. Our written submission includes specific recommendations to this committee. I will summarize the recommendations as follows. Firstly, Canada's land policies need to catch up with the era of reconciliation instead of confrontation. Reconciliation requires timely diligence in pursuit of its objectives. Secondly, claims and treaty negotiation policies, as well as ATR policies, need to support First Nations and neighboring Canadians in resolving land issues to the benefit of all. Third, Canada's ATR policy is broken. We hope for this committee's support on our recommendations for a completely new approach, which is aimed at overcoming intolerable delays. Our aim is to break down the policy limitations and the current reliance on federal tools, systems, and personnel. Fourth, we also hope for this committee's support in convincing Canada to break down barriers between its own self-government land policies. We have a proven track record of success under the Framework Agreement on Reserves. Thank you, Miigwech, for your question. Welcome your questions along with my friend, Mr. Bynon from the Resource Center. Merci, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goulet. We go next to the Lower Similkameen Indian Band, and Ms. Lauren Terbasket, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the committee to be present for this important topic on land restitution. In Mistim Naslin Dumisquis tui Pipiliacanus tui Quichin Mit, Ichimala Isquisos Hitulahus Tulachpita us tui Simlau. I speak the names of my mother, my late mother and father, John Terbasket and Delphine Alec Abraham, as well as my children, Hitulau, who is Councilman Ira Edward, and my daughter Tanisha Begay. I speak the names of my ancestry and descendants, because their names tie us inextricably to our lands and our water and our tumi, which are all living things. My homelands are the Similkameen and Tulameen watersheds in south central British Columbia and Washington State. It's comprised of over 7,500 square kilometers in British Columbia and 1,700 square kilometers in Washington State. Our tribe, the Okanagan Nation tribe, is cut in half by the Canada-US border, with 12 of our tribes in Washington State, with 7 in Canada. Our lands are unceded. We have never sold, nor have we ceded our lands through treaty or any other legal mechanism. The Similkameen Okanagan systems are one of 3 biodiversity hotspots in Canada, hosting 77 terrestrial species at risk, including 28 that only exist in the Okanagan Similkameen. I'm involved as a negotiator and a policy analyst for the Similkameen people and the Similkameen government. We're working through National Park Reserve negotiations and MOUs with Environment Canada through the Canadian Wildlife Service to find pathways to overcome policy and funding barriers that will enable us to protect our homelands, both for food sovereignty and biodiversity purposes. In March of 2022, the Similkameen people declared an area of approximately 150,000 square hectares as an Indigenous protected area, the Achinula protected area. We did this because we could not get the support nor the tables established that would allow us to develop collaborative relationships with the federal and provincial governments, despite all of our attempts. We're working to translate our oral traditional laws into written law in order to further the process of legal pluralism and harmonization of legal order between the Crown and our nation, and to incorporate by reference our Silk water law and our Tamik laws through our National Park Reserve discussions. We're working to address the impacts of legislative impairments from the species at risk that will allow us to define and develop processes to compensate our trade lands so that we can protect those species which are so vulnerable and exist sometimes within our reservation lands only, or are protected through limited access through our reservations. Based on the water warming trends, extreme water overallocation, situations caused by clear-cut logging and siltation caused by clear-cut logging and mining contamination of sulfates, arsenic, and mercury that are leaching into the Similkameen systems, we can see that we are at a critical juncture in terms of our timeframes of Indigenous nations to restore our systems, where the provincial and federal governments have not. The treaty process and lengthy, expensive court proceedings leave Canada, the provinces, and First Nations in a perpetual state of animosity, distrust, and economic uncertainty. These are not viable solutions. So what recommendations do we make? First, that restitution within the traditional lands of the Similkameen and Syilx and all Indigenous people, in fact, must be framed within the context of our historic and future sovereignty and unceded and unimpaired jurisdiction over our land and our resources. We must make way for the constructs and pathways that allow for legal pluralism. We know that there are mechanisms that allow for transfer of lands across governments, such as lands that are transferred from provincial to federal jurisdiction through the parks process or additions to reserve. What is needed are pathways to allow for restoration, not to Indian reserves that are mired in bureaucratic red tape, but to sovereign tribal lands that make room for true reconciliation and legal pluralism within our homelands and this country that we call Canada. Recognizing and enforcing Indigenous laws are a mechanism that would allow us to hold industry accountable where colonial governments have not. This is an imperative for both colonial and Indigenous citizens, as we all pay the price through taxation and through health costs and through expensive legal costs when our fights end up in colonial court systems. What is needed are stable financial commitments that would enable us to protect, restore, and also build economic models that are based on the concepts of sustainability. We need processes that include nations that are cross international borders, that do not pit us against our brothers and sisters across the US and Canada, but that ensure cooperative, collaborative agreements. We hope that in moving forward that the committee will look at these important issues. White Linland.
Thank you very much. We now go to the Métis Nation of Alberta. I'm not sure who's going to speak, so I open the floor to either one of you.
Good afternoon. Audrey Patra, President, Métis Nation of Alberta. And yes, I'm very pleased to have Jason Madden along with me today. I join you today from the Métis Nation homeland in what is now Alberta. The Métis Nation is one of Canada's Indigenous people, and that is still our homeland, and this will be our homeland forever. The rivers and lakes, forests and prairies of Alberta help shape the Métis people. As a nation, we were born of the land, and we continue to depend on Alberta's lands and resources. Many Métis citizens hunt, fish, trap, and gather, just as the Métis always have. They put food on their tables and sustain their families. They help keep our culture alive. We have had to fight for generations to have our rights to the lands respected. When Canada expanded into the Northwest following Confederation, we were already here. We had a right to be treated as a nation, to be negotiated with as equals, and to fair compensation for any lands that were taken. In October of 1869, a group of Métis, led by Louis Riel, chased Canadian surveyors out of Manitoba to defend our Métis lands. Weeks later, they declared the provisional government in Manitoba to negotiate for the protection of our lands. And they did, but Canada failed to fulfill its promise. The Métis were persecuted, uprooted, and scattered. Canada moved across the prairies, making treaties with our First Nations, but did nothing for us. So the Métis began to organize. In 1877, at Blackfoot Crossing, Métis petitioned Canada for assistance in settling land. In 1878, in Cypress Hills, Métis petitioned Canada for a reserve. In 1880, in St. Albert, Métis petitioned Canada to survey their lots. And do you know what Canada did? Nothing. Worse than nothing, Canada opened the West for settlement and sold our homeland out from under us. We had to act, we had to resist. In 1885, we declared a second provisional government. That year at Batoche, Canada tried to break us. They captured Riel, held a kangaroo trial, and killed him. But we are still here, and Canada knew it. This is when they gave us scrip, pieces of paper that offered nothing but false promises. Now, reduced to coupons, our homeland was systematically bought up by speculators and used to underwrite our own colonization. By the end of the century, Canada had reduced the Métis, the Otipemisiwak, to squatting on Crown land, on the fringes of white towns, and being called the road allowance people. Again, we organized. In 1897, Métis and St. Albert advocated for the fair handling of Métis land claims and petitioned Ottawa for improvements to the scrip system. In 1911, Métis from Lesser Slave Lake petitioned Canada to investigate the fraud that plagued the scrip system. In 1920, Métis from Fort Chipewyan requested that Canada establish a royal commission to investigate scrip fraud. Canada responded by changing the criminal code to make it impossible to prosecute scrip fraud and to protect the land speculators who swindled us out of our rights. Canada, not Alberta, had legal responsibility for the lands in the province, but at the end of the 1920s, Canada proposed to transfer responsibility for the prairies to the provincial governments. Once again, we organized. In 1928, led by Charles Delorme, we advocated for the right of Métis living on Crown land. In 1932, we organized more formally as what is now known as the Métis Nation of Alberta. In response to Métis lobbying, Alberta appointed the Ewing Commission to report on Métis health, education, homelessness, and land issues. After a 2-year investigation, the Commission recommended that the province provide Métis with a secure land. In 1938, Alberta created the province's 12 original Métis colonies, now known as the Métis settlements, the only legally recognized Métis land base in the country. Alberta later rescinded 4 of those colonies. And today, most Métis in Alberta do not live on the remaining colonies. Our fight, however, has had to continue. The wrongs of scrip have not been reconciled. Our rights of a nation has yet to be fully respected. Thank you.
Thank you so much for our witnesses. We will now begin with our first round of questioning. We begin with the Conservatives for 6 minutes. We have Eric Melillo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here on this important study. I want to start with the First Nations Land Advisory Board, the gentleman in the room. Just to maybe start with a quick question. I wasn't planning to ask, but it came up in the opening remarks. You mentioned, Mr. Goulet, that you didn't like the term restitution, and you provided a bit of context to that. I'm just wondering briefly if you can maybe offer a different term or a further explanation as to why you feel that way.
Okay. My friend Mr. Bynan will help responding here.
Terminology may be something that different nations or the Métis or Inuit may have different views of terminology. But one of the difficulties, as suggested by Phil Goulet, is that restitution sounds like a recognition that all of the sovereignty and rights are with the Crown, and that the Crown then gives lands back or renounces what the Crown had. And many First Nations, in my experience, start from a proposition that there wasn't a fair dealing in the past, or a renunciation or surrender or ceding of rights. So in terms of a different terminology, other terms like reconciliation or addressing the lands question in Canada. But I think there needs to be a bit of flexibility depending on the particular First Nations or Inuit or Métis in Canada.
I appreciate that context, and also to the opening remarks that were made. You mentioned, I believe, around the additions to the reserve process, there was some of the claims that had lasted a quarter of a century and still ongoing. I've heard a number of concerns. I come from northwestern Ontario, Treaty 3, Treaty 9 territory. I have a number of 42 First Nations in my electoral district, many of which are remote, isolated communities. I've heard a number of concerns with the addition to reserve process. I'm curious to get your thoughts, your view on what specifically is the failure or the holdup that is causing these massive delays, and how should we look to fix it?
Okay, thank you, Miigwech, for the question and letting me share part of your day with all of you today. If we look at all of those examples where our lands have been in limbo for quite some time, including the area that you mentioned, I have friends in the Grand Council Treaty 3 area as well. The cost of how do you measure the cost of lands being tied up in limbo for so long? We were fortunate, where I come from, to have such a good rapport with the neighboring municipalities to be able to develop economic development projects. And as a land management community, we have close to 100 businesses now, First Nation and non-First Nation, and partnerships that are going ahead and investing and creating a strong economy and strong social fabric on good faith, because those lands are still really in question. And I hope I'm answering your question here, but we're going to need to see a process that's completely revamped. If you talk to the land managers, the frontline workers, landspeople within our communities, they're going to tell you that, tell all of us, that there's just so much red tape. And I think that's where your question is coming from. It's the left hand doesn't seem to know what the right hand's doing. And there are people, in fact, that have started working on our file from our community that have come on board and have moved papers from one side of the desk to the other. And still today, as I mentioned in my comments today, the final desired end result is still not there. We don't have those lands back under clear title, which is awkward for investors and for developers. So we're not moving, not able to move at the speed of business, but we've done quite well so far. So when the red tape, I guess, if we had to narrow it down, when one of the spokespeople said earlier, the same thing, just so much red tape, it's horrendous for our workers who are charged with the responsibility of bringing in accurate information.
I appreciate that context very much, and definitely understand the frustration that you would have with that, the fact that it would hinder so much development and economic opportunity. Curious as well, with limited time, just to stay on the same topic with the additions to reserve. I think you did a great job there of outlining the problem with the red tape. I'm curious, just genuine curiosity from your point of view, has there been specific rationale or explanation given from the department to explain these delays? And I'm wondering if you could share some of that with us.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, please.
When you read the current ATR policy, it now stretches for 59 pages, including a 13-page application form, and requires First Nations typically to provide a 20-page submission just to get their ATR submission started. The ATR policy sets very narrow, restricted categories under which Canada might consider adding lands. I suggest to this committee, and we take it up in our written submission, that if you're looking at restitution or lands back, there needs to be a much more positive policy. We do not think that it's possible to simply adjust the current process or procedures and make progress. An entirely new approach needs to be put in place. And fundamentally, what we suggest is a number of steps that are in the current procedures are getting in the way of progress, preventing a benefit for both First Nations and for neighboring communities. Particularly with framework agreement, First Nations,
Thank you, Mr.
which
Bynum.
have
We've
a
gone way
governance
over
system,
time. Perhaps
better-
another questioner will be able to pick up where you left off. Sorry, we were way over time. Mr. Weiler from the Liberals is up next for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank Mr. Goulet and Mr. Baton to be here in person and our witnesses for joining virtually as well. I want to ask my first question to Ms. Turbasket, and I really appreciate your testimony, and you brought up some very interesting points to start today, and particularly in light of the Indigenous protected and conserved area that the nations declared the Ashnola IPCA, I understand. And at this point, the Government of Canada and the Government of British Columbia are in the process of negotiating a nature agreement that's going to set out how the province is going to get to 25% of lands protected in BC by 2025. And I was hoping you could speak to the importance of working in partnership with First Nations in this effort, and also how you see your idea of legal pluralism being able to be implemented in this work as well.
Thank you for your question. Yes, the nature agreement. I think that one of the concerns that we have with the provincial federal nature agreement is that there is very limited First Nations input into even the drafting of the document. We had heard, I guess, through outside means that there were maybe 2 or 3 potentially advisors to the work that's being undertaken, but the nature agreement, the draft of it, as well as any input from those nations related to the barriers that we face in terms of protecting lands are excluded. And typically what happens within the province and I guess within the federal government is something is drafted and then brought for comment. And one of the really important factors that need to be considered is that the nations need to hold the pen. I think we are most experienced with those barriers that we face when it comes to the protection of biodiversity and food sovereignty on our own lands. We face the legal mechanisms that are barriers. More recently for IPCAs, we were unable and are still unable to get the province to make a commitment to move forward with IPCAs, that they are telling us that they have no current policy and that now they're looking at the biodiversity framework as a mechanism, but we're again excluded from those conversations. And so I think that what's important is the potential for those nations who have moved forward bravely with their IPCA declarations and are moving forward is to include us in those discussions, to include some very key principles that come from all of our perspectives, whether they're from the north or the south. We come from very diverse areas and very diverse ecosystems, and those things need to be considered in the policy documents that are moved forward through both Canada and the province.
Thank you very much for that. Next, I'd like to ask the First Nations Lands Advisory Board a couple questions, and apologies, I don't have your written submission in advance, but I do hope I have a chance to see that in short order, because I understand you have 4 main overall priorities and policy changes that you're advocating for. And I want to just touch on the last one that you brought up around breaking down barriers for self-government. And I do have a self-governing First Nation in my riding in the Sechelt Nation, and I know the process that they went through negotiating the modernization of that agreement was, could probably be described as torturous. And so I'm very curious about your perspectives on how this process could be ameliorated to ensure that we can move forward in a more expeditious way.
Very quickly, we do deal with that in 2 areas in our document. Number one, the policies show a reluctance to trust First Nation governments and First Nation governance of lands. The policies need to be more embracing of reconciliation and recognizing that self-government has succeeded in Canada. That's issue number one. Issue number two, a lot of the First Nations which have negotiated self-government agreements have a positive relationship with their neighbors. And so a drive to a less confrontational and more reconciliation-based approach with a better understanding of the benefits beyond First Nations can help accelerate those. And then the last point that we make in our paper is that a lot of First Nations have escaped the antiquated, ineffective Indian Act system of lands management and gone to our land code system. But in order to go to a modern treaty or to a broader self-government agreement, you have to agree with Canada to renounce the framework agreement and all of the work that has been done under it. And it's that which we're suggesting is a barrier to moving ahead with self-government. If First Nations want to keep the framework agreement under another self-government agreement, they should have that option, and that would help accelerate things.
Thank you very much for that. I don't have much time left, but just was hoping you could quickly touch on how the Lands Advisory Board incorporates traditional knowledge and Indigenous perspectives into land management practices and decision making.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Well, we continue to observe all the protocols in our gatherings and things that we were taught back many years ago by our elders and still learn from our elders and our teachers. So we make sure that all of our, cultural concerns, we try to address and make sure that they're observed throughout our, as we work and go forward.
Okay, thank you very much. We've kind of touched over there. Thank you so much. Going now to the Bloc Québécois. Madame Gill, 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I also want to thank each of the witnesses for being here with us today. I have a number of questions. I'll start with Audrey Poitras. Now, as a Quebecer, I have to say that my heart is very close to the Métis Nation, and Louis Riel, to us, is a big part of our history. That said, I'd like to hear what you have to say, first of all, about your definition of self-government. And my second question for you, which I also asked to the First Nations Land Advisory Board, is, what are the difficulties that you're facing? So what are the forces that you come up against? So sort of three questions there, and I'll give the floor to Ms. Poitras to answer.
Thank you very much for the question. And actually, I should pass it over to Jason, who probably can respond to that more effectively.
I think on your first question about self-government, the history of the Métis and First Nations are almost like through the looking glass. Canada's approach in the First Nations context was, control and assimilation approaches through the Indian Act and other measures. And for the Métis, it's, well, if we ignore them long enough, hopefully they'll go away and just absorb into the body politic. And so that lack of recognition of Métis self-government has been almost the fundamental problem. The Métis Nation of Alberta is 90 plus years old and uses still an association under the Alberta Societies Act in order to have its legal status and capacity recognized. So that undermines and delegitimizes Métis self-government, which is just as vibrant and strong as other Indigenous people's self-government. So I would say that, and of course, we've been making progress on that in recent years and hope to be pushing that further. But that's the fundamental stop. It's why whenever you hear Métis leaders speak, self-government is the raison d'etre of what they have been pushing with Canada, because it's been that history of denial since the days of Riel that has been stifling. And then to just go further on it, those difficulties are because of that lack of recognition, areas, whether it's in child and family services or whether it's in just undertaking decision-making over, for the Métis in relation to themselves, is frustrated. And I think self-government for the Métis in particular is seen as a vehicle to overcome those difficulties, because at least it's a starting point, and you begin with a nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship. The land-related issues, in many ways, we haven't even got to yet in finally dealing with the legacy of Métis script and also the other challenges of a lack of recognition of Métis lands. But I would highlight that's why for the Métis in particular, recognition of self-government is so fundamental and so key. And it isn't, it's kind of, as I said, different in different contexts for other Indigenous peoples.
Merci, Monsieur Madden.
Thanks very much, Mr. Madden. I'd like to hear you or Mr. or Ms. Poitras speak a little bit as well about the difficulties that you're facing when it comes to self-government. But are there any other difficulties other than self-government? And what do you think that we should be looking at as a committee to ensure that things move forward? And of course, I mean, in relation to the federal government, what can we do?
I think that one of the biggest challenges, and the Supreme Court of Canada has called Métis living in what's called a legal lacuna, i.e. a legal gap. There's a lack of policy. So many of the policies you're talking about in relation to dealing with First Nations land or dealing with Inuit, they simply don't exist within the federal system for the Métis. The starting point, we don't even have a self-government, policy. What has been driving the policy development have been the self-government agreements that have been negotiated between Métis governments and Canada as of late and are being implemented. But that lack of a clear articulation of the relationship is one of the most fundamental problems or the challenges that are being faced. Now, we're hoping to fill in that legal gap by virtue of legislation and by virtue of implementing those self-government agreements. But what's also a real fundamental issue for the Métis when it comes to lands is there isn't a Métis claims policy. Whereas, for better or worse, there are specific claims and comprehensive claims available to First Nations. For the Métis in relation to dealing with script, that doesn't exist. And I think that, the case, Madame Poitras spoke about the Manitoba Métis Federation case that took 32 years to get to the Supreme Court of Canada, and they were successful there. Outside of litigation, Métis have no other way to advance their land-related claims with Canada because there are no policies right now. And so that legal gap, I think, needs to be addressed. And that's we're not even just complaining about policies. We don't even have any policies in order to begin the conversation on those land-related issues.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Madam Gill. That was 6 minutes. Going to the NDP now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for your presentation. Each of your presentations were a pleasure to listen to. First of all, I have a question for Lauren. I was really pleased to hear your presentation in regards to Indigenous laws and that they need to be utilized more often. Regarding this subject, can you please explain furthermore why it is so important, in particular with the topic of restitution of lands to First Nations, Inuit and Métis?
The way that the Snoqualmie people have been implementing, I guess, our own laws, we're oral tradition, and one of the barriers that we face is the recording of our oral tradition and the documenting of that. I think that one of the reasons that it's so important in terms of land restitution is that it is the cornerstone of the governance and protection of our land bases. Where we sit now, we see that through a number of cases, Blueberry and others, that the cumulative impacts that have degraded the land base, the treaty, and Indigenous rights and title that have come from this lack of or mismanagement of both federal and provincial governments have resulted in extensive degradation. And the other issue that we see related to federal or provincial legal application of their law is that there is a bias toward, I guess, industry and toward development. There is not the consideration of the cost of degradation in terms of biodiversity, but the health costs that come from that. And so Indigenous law brings to the forefront, I believe, the concepts of sustainability, and it doesn't throw out the concept of modern and historic economic models, but it allows us to bring those into, I guess, some level of balance, where today we are, a lot of times when we're talking about protection and environmental restoration or protection, usually those concepts are thrown out in the interest of the public, right? So whether those are housing or whether that's business, there is no clear balance between the protection for or management for biodiversity and also the management for economic gain and benefit. And so Indigenous law, I believe, brings that concept of sustainability and biodiversity to the forefront.
Thank you for your answer. My second question is directed to Audrey. Audrey, it's really great to see you. In regards to Métis, when I was still in post-secondary education, I would like to ask you in regards to the subject of self-determination. For the Métis people, you've had boundaries or obstacles. How can we be more helpful as parliamentarians towards your self-determination?
Yes, we certainly have had our struggles. And I think that, our people have always tried to work very hard with relationships and with figuring out how to work with all governments. And I know for us, we believe that it is about relationships, and it is about Canada and all Indigenous people working together and figuring out how you support each other. Because for us here as Métis, we're also Albertans, we're also Canadians, and we believe we all need to do better. Recognition has been non-existent.
Inaudible.
I think you might be on mute. Want to continue? Ms. Midlow, did you want to continue? I've stopped your clock here.
Part of the answer from Audrey was inaudible. I would appreciate her concluding her answer.
A few words of your answer.
Can you hear me now? So I clearly believe that definitely there's been a lot of struggles for the Métis, but it's all because of non-recognition. Recognition is one of the key pieces, and of course that's what we've been pushing with our self-government agreements, and we believe that we all need to work together. This is our country, Canada, made up of all of us, but certainly all Indigenous people have to be recognized and respected. And for us here in Alberta, we always say, yes, we're Métis, but we're Albertans and we're Canadians. And when we do something that's right for Métis, it's also right for Albertans and Canadians. And it's really about the relationship and the working together and the recognition that will make us all move forward further together. Thank you.
Okay, you have about 25 seconds, Ms. Idlip.
Yes, I just want to reiterate my gratitude for all the witnesses' presentations. We're not only talking about land back, we all know this, and we're all aware that each of our customary practices, Indigenous laws, we are trying to regain our traditional practices. And if we're going to be making changes as First Nations, Métis, Inuit, we need to utilize our Indigenous laws. Thank you for your presentations.
Okay, thank you very much to our witnesses. Unfortunately, we don't have time for a second round. I do apologize. But if there's anything more you wish to share with us, you can do so in written form, and we will definitely consider that in our final report. I am going to suspend for just a few minutes. We'll do a sound test and return momentarily. back to order. So I'm pleased to welcome our second panel of the day for the land study of restitution for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We have three guests today from the Office of the Treaty Commissioner. We also have Treaty One Nation and Treaty Land Entitlement Committee of Manitoba. We will start off our 5 minutes round with our guests, starting with, I guess we have Chris Henderson here in person. So with the sharp purple tie, we will start with him from the Land Entitlement Committee of Manitoba. You have 5 minutes.
Miigwech, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Bonjour, Anin, Tansei. Good afternoon, good evening to the committee members. Chris Henderson, Indigenous. My name's Chris Henderson, and my father comes from a community known as Black River First Nation in Manitoba. He's Anishinaabe or Ojibwe. My mother comes from a Swampy Cree community known as the Sapatoyak Cree Nation in Midwestern Manitoba. My name's Chris Henderson, and I am the Executive Director of the Treaty Land Entitlement Committee of Manitoba. We are a standalone, rights-based organization dedicated to helping our member First Nations try to get what they were first promised when the number of treaties were signed in Manitoba. We are a signatory to this big green book known as the Manitoba Framework Agreement on Treaty Land Entitlement. This was signed 26 years ago, and at that time, 26 years ago, the Prime Minister of Canada was the Right Honourable Jean Chrétien, and the Premier of Manitoba was Mr. Gary Filmon. And I was about a young lad at the tender age of 25 years old. So this framework agreement, while not a treaty, is an implementation agreement to try to, well, it would try to resolve the outstanding treaty land claims that our member First Nations had against both Crown governments. For your background information, some First Nations, shortly after the signing of their numbered treaties, particularly treaties number 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 10, with Her Majesty the Queen and Right of Canada between 1871 and 1910, which provided, among other obligations, that Canada would lay aside and reserve tracts of land for the exclusive use and benefit for First Nations. So it's important to acknowledge that some First Nations received their full allotment of reserve land, and others did not, as promised under the treaties with the Crown. So for those First Nations that did not receive their full allotment of reserve land, they started their research and negotiations in the 1970s, actually. And over the next 20 years, they tried to negotiate to resolve these outstanding treaty land entitlement claims. So finally, in 1997, on May 29th, this framework agreement was signed with the Government of Canada and the Province of Manitoba. And since that time, only 15 out of 21 entitlement First Nations actually signed on to this framework agreement. So the other 6, unfortunately, decided not to accept what was being offered by way of land and a financial payment being provided for under the framework agreement. So 26 years after the signing of the framework agreement, Canada has set aside over 565,000 acres of land as reserve for these 15 First Nations. However, I should also point out that regrettably, Canada has breached its obligations under the framework agreement, and that was noted in a court decision that was also provided, I hope, to each member of the committee. Because of that, this breach continues. What this breach is that Canada unilaterally changed the original agreed to step-by-step land transfer and reserve creation process without the written consent of our member First Nations. So what I mean specifically by that is that before land was to be set apart as a reserve under the framework agreement, Canada said, well, we now have to let other potentially affected Aboriginal groups know about these lands that are going to be about to be set apart as a reserve. We have to consult with them. So when this framework agreement was signed in 1997, that was not the focus. The focus was to try to give land back to the First Nations. But now, since 2012, the focus has been on Canada ensuring it meets its consultation obligation. So we weren't opposed to that when we were advised of this back in 2012, because there is a process to try to negotiate amendments to the framework agreement. But regrettably, Canada did not listen to us. So as a result, we took Canada to court, and we were successful in that court proceedings. So over the years, there have been numerous studies.
Mr. Henderson, I might have to get you to wrap it up.
Sure, yep, most definitely. There has been numerous studies over the years commissioned by Parliament. And I would also note that the late Minister Jim Prentice actually made TLE implementation a priority back in 2004. He made a commitment, a ministerial commitment, to try to accelerate and expedite the process in Manitoba. And unfortunately, over this past fiscal year, no lands were set apart as a reserve under the framework agreement. And in this time of truth and reconciliation, the dispossession of First Nations to treaty lands sadly continues, regrettably. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Going next to Broken Head Ojibwe Nation, we have Chief Gordon Blue Sky, please, from Treaty 1 Nation.
Bushu, Wasiki, Dishnakos, Mekanato Dam, Paskana Biwisi Bing Unji, Ugama Khan. I have come to you from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory. I am really honored to have the opportunity to speak here today to the Parliamentary Committee. We have a situation here in our territory where our Treaty 1 communities, 7 First Nations, and I'll speak more specifically on my community, live in a territory that has been essentially developed without any sort of consideration for my people or our rights or our right to hunt, fish, or trap, and ultimately fish in our territory, given the fact that there's been major development within Treaty 1. Now, I'm not sure if the committee members are aware of our territory, but it stretches from the U.S. border into the Lake of the Woods, which is southern eastern Manitoba, and into Brandon and western Manitoba, and in between the interlake, Lake Winnipeg and Lake Manitoba. These lands have been, agreed upon since 1871, August 3rd, and we are currently, majority of our First Nations are also treaty land entitlement communities. We've had come together to work on a parcel of land known as the former Capillon Barracks, now known and is reserve, now known as Nawe Odina. That property is about approximately 109 acres, and it was a former barracks site and was in dispute with our First Nations for the past 19 years, going on 20 years. We just recently had that property turned to reserve. I always like to describe my territory as being overly developed and describe the situation that we're in, because we are in a situation where our children are being taught where not to hunt versus how to hunt. And it becomes a really challenging situation when we start to look at how we do accomplish things like getting our land back to our First Nation in terms of restitution. We have been through this process now for 25 years. We've actually seen the process of treaty land entitlement lapse in terms of the current agreement and the work that we've been doing. So for us, it's been a really challenging situation that we've been, we have the majority of the municipalities that are now situated within Treaty 1. The majority of Manitoba's population lives within our territory. We have industries like agricultural that has essentially left our land base down to nil. We have hydro transmission lines that come in to feed a metropolis like Winnipeg that have also occupied other properties as well. We have, again, crown lands that are very, very rare and very in our territory, but are even those lands that are crown lands are also being leased to farmers. So essentially for us, it's become a very critical state where we are. You know, we get to watch all these videos and all these wonderful projects that are happening in other territories. And I can't speak on behalf of the Northern Cree or Inuit or Dene or anything like that. But I always see these nice projects about how they're, you know, restoring their environment, how they're taking care of the polar bear, caribou, and whatnot, and so on. And in our case here in southern Manitoba, we have no lands left to even protect. So where we are now is that we're now in this process now. Reclamation of land includes municipal property, municipal lands, private lands that we have to purchase and go through a process, which is left for us to kind of navigate on our own. Municipal officials really feel that the process itself that's been outlined is a bit of an intrusive one, which I could probably appreciate from their perspective, given the fact that we've lived through the opposite as well. But with that being said, our communities are left basically to navigate these disputes, whether it be with a third-party interest or with a local municipality, without any sort of mechanism in place to help us settle disputes that are long-standing. I actually just got off the phone this morning with the provincial government about a right-of-way, road right-of-way that was identified in 2009. And they tell us today that it's actually no longer required. So it took 14 years for that to happen. I'm also sitting with municipalities that we're still ongoing municipal servicing discussions that have been going on for about 16 years. And again, this is unacceptable. I would assume if the federal or provincial government required any of these lands for X or Y or Z, these things would have a process where we could actually go for dispute. But in the case of the Capillon Barracks, we were successful. It wasn't until after lengthy court battles, until after disputes with Canada, that they finally sat down and signed a comprehensive settlement agreement with their communities, and we now have our reserve Nawi. And of course, having that land back is a significant step forward for our communities and provides an excellent opportunity for ourselves to really explore the economic opportunities that should have been there from day one. You know, this dispute started in 2002, and I came to the table in 2004 as a young person at that time, but now we're...
Chief, sorry to interrupt. You're quite a bit over time. Is there any way you can wrap it up, and then we'll get to, I'm sure, more of what you have to say in questions.
Yep, and we'll leave it there. I guess that's my wrap up.
Okay, well, thank you. That was good. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I don't like cutting people off. Next up is the Office of the Treaty Commissioner, Ms. Culbertson. Now, we had a few issues with your sound, so hopefully we have that solved, and we will be able to hear you nice and clear. Please proceed. 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'll try not to take all of the 5 minutes. And INAN, Aninsigokin, Indejnakazu, and Mary Musqueam Culbertson. I am the Treaty Commissioner for Saskatchewan. I have a Juris Doctor of Law from the University of Saskatchewan, and I thank you for inviting me to give testimony here today on lands and restitution. I acknowledge the land that I am currently living in is Treaty 6 land, and my home territory of Treaty 4, Kizikus First Nation. As a Treaty Commissioner, I'm the first Indigenous woman Treaty Commissioner. And I say that because I look at the land in a much different way than my predecessors. I hold a Juris Doctor of Laws from the U of S, but at Treaty, my ancestors, the non-First Nations and First Nations side, wanted a better future for their future generations to live here. They wanted the cunning of the white man, to be able to have doctorates, to be the lawyers, to have all the level of education that the newcomers would be having. So when I look at things differently from an Indigenous perspective and also have to sit in the middle of my people in the Crown, being the Treaty Commissioner. So I'm giving this from an equitable point of view, whereas I'm not going to be neutral here, because neutral means you're not taking a side. In the terms of equity, the side that I am taking is of the treaty nations. And I have a lot to say about land restitution and the access to land and the limitation of land in order to exercise treaty and inherent rights. Restitution of land is vital to reconciliation efforts in the future of treaty and inherent rights in these territories. It includes and is not limited to food security and economic participation, land stewardship, and in the province that we are currently sitting in, even though treaties were here before these provinces were created, Saskatchewan in particular in 1905, the federal government has, through division of powers, of course, delegated certain authorities, as you may say, to the provinces. One of those authorities that was delegated in 1930 was the NRTA, the Natural Resources Transfer Act, that affects Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta. In Saskatchewan, we have further legislation in regards to lands, such as the Sask Trespass Act that was amended in 2022. We have the Sask First Act that was introduced by the Saskatchewan government and came into effect in this year, 2023. It was passed by readings in the House. And then we have other policies that limit the ability to access land, such as additions to reserve policy that currently sits in Indigenous Services Canada. So all of these processes, legislations, policies limit the ability to exercise rights. It limits access to the land, and it limits living and making a living from the land. So I will be answering any questions that the committee members may have when it comes to these particular acts and how it limits land and access to it and the exercise of rights. In this province as well, we have the online sales of Crown lands. And when you're selling off Crown lands, I believe that it's not just Treaty First Nations and people who use the land to sustain themselves that should be concerned. It should be all people concerned, because we shouldn't be selling off Crown lands. We shouldn't be selling off any lands when you still have outstanding treaty obligations that need to be made. Like the speaker before me mentioning the treaty land entitlement, the Office of the Treaty Commissioner in Saskatchewan was actually created to settle the outstanding treaty land entitlement issues. And the first commissioner was Cliff Wright, and his task was to create a framework and come to an understanding between all the parties involved. Excuse me. Since that time, the Office of the Treaty Commissioner has been written out of any matters to do with treaty land entitlement. In our current mandate that is currently being updated and worked on by a Chiefs Committee through the FSIN, they have identified where those gaps are that the Commission needs to be able to be part of again. So we have many First Nations that still do not have their treaty land entitlement lands that they bought to make up their shortfall acres turned into reserve status. The barrier there is the additions to reserve. We have First Nations that have put in interest when it comes to sale of Crown lands.
Ms. Culbertson, I'm sorry, you've gone over. I know your goal was not to hit the 5 minutes, but you've gone a bit over.
I know.
Any chance you can wrap it up, and we'll probably get to you in questions.
No problem. Any questions? I'll be looking forward to Miigwech.
Oh, that's it? Wow. Okay. Thank you. All right. For 6 minutes, we kick it off with the Conservatives and Bob Zimmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Gordon Bluesky, you mentioned something of concern to me. I'm the co-chair of the Parliamentary Outdoor Caucus, and what we do in this place in Ottawa is to represent people that hunt and fish and sport shoot and trap. And you made a comment, you said, we are being taught not to hunt. Can you please explain?
Well, I'm not necessarily stating that we're being taught not to hunt. What we are challenged with is where to hunt. And the issue that we have in our territory, Broken Head is surrounded, and I would say all of our First Nations are completely surrounded by hunting. Farming, agricultural, and municipalities, private lands, the city of Winnipeg, the city of Selkirk. there really is no place for us to exercise the ability to hunt, trap, or anything. You know, like some of our communities up north have always said, you know, I remind them to be really grateful for what they do have still, even though there are impacts up there, but they have a lot more than we do. As you all know, possibly, maybe some of you don't, it's a real hostile environment out there with our people when it comes to interactions with settler populations, with agricultural populations. When it comes to hunting, we're met with aggression. You know, in our particular case in Treaty 1, the areas that are considered Crown are now being leased out again for further agricultural practices. So our communities really are challenged with teaching our children even how to hunt.
Thanks, Gordon. And one thing that it's interesting that you mentioned that. So losing access to hunting sounds like it's a concern to you. We were up in Cambridge Bay not that long ago where we talked to the Kitmiut Inuit Association, and they brought their concern to us that there's a thing and a member across the way in the Liberal Party, Mr. Weiler, mentioned 25 by 25. Well, there's a new initiative called 30 by 30, and it's talking about protecting 30% of lands and 30% of oceans. And what they brought up is a concern that they were being, these areas were being kind of segregated without consultation of local Inuit and First Nations. And I guess when I hear you say something like that, it kind of rings true about being concerned about 30 by 30 and its implications to not just non-First Nations, but First Nations as well. Are you concerned that are you being consulted with 30 by 30?
No, you know, and honestly, I'm sorry, I don't know exactly what you're referencing, but I do know a couple of things. Whenever we have the Canadian initiatives and projects that they have going on where they're talking about protecting 10%, 20%, 17% of Canada lands for Canadians, none of those lands are ever, and I've followed up with a lot of them, and I started to follow, you know, what projects is Canada focusing in on. These are projects that are happening in territories my people will never be in, Northwest Territories, you know, Nunavut and stuff like that. Like, we need to have things that are protected here in Treaty 1 that we can benefit and our children can benefit into the future. So what I'm concerned about is that we've never been consulted ever in the development of our territory. When it was referenced earlier about the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement, the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement outlines the obligations to, you know, make sure that the First Nations have lands to sustain themselves, and that's never happened in my territory. And there's never been any consideration to that.
Well, I appreciate that, and I guess I would challenge the government, and we can reach out and even chat about what 30 by 30 is and what the plans of the. It's in the Minister's Mandate Letter for Environment and Climate Change in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans very clearly. First paragraph really is the implementation of 30 by 30. So there's, you know, we're already in 2023. There's 7 years left where all this stuff is going to start to roll in. And I guess I'm concerned to hear that you haven't even been consulted or heard about 30 by 30. So, but that's something that we can inform you about, Gordon, and happy to do so. My colleague, Mr. Vidal, I guess he was going to ask questions, but he's not available. But maybe let me go to Mr. Henderson just briefly, because the one thing I have two Métis, a niece and a nephew that are Métis. They live in British Columbia. But I know that one of the challenges in Manitoba especially is, maybe I'll ask it as a question. Are competing claims between Métis and First Nations an issue? And if they are an issue, how do you intend to resolve those issues?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a good one. And that does speak to the heart of the dispute that we're currently find ourselves involved in. Like I said earlier, the initial focus for all parties to the framework agreement was to allow or try to permit First Nations to select or acquire choice lands. However, the federal Crown determined that prior to 2012, they did not have this constitutional duty to consult other Aboriginal communities about lands that would become set apart as reserve lands. So now this issue is currently one of many issues we're trying to resolve through negotiations with a negotiator appointed by Minister Mark Miller. So we are trying to resolve it, but certainly we too, as First Nations, want other concessions brought up at the negotiating table. So we hope that within the coming months we'll be able to resolve, as you said, this clash of claims that we're dealing with in Manitoba.
Okay, thank you very much. That's the end of that round. Next to the Liberals, Marcus Pawlowski. Looks like he's ready to go.
Yeah,
6
thanks.
minutes.
Thanks for coming, Mr. Henderson. I'm interested in the Manitoba Treaty Land Entitlement Agreement and how that's worked. Now, you mentioned that you represent some Treaty 3 communities, which I found interesting, and I think Eric Malilo finds interesting because there's Treaty 3 communities in our ridings as well on the Ontario side. So how does that complicate the negotiation process when you have two provinces involved with the same treaty area?
Sure. Just to respond to that point, we only have one member First Nation who's signatory to Treaty 3. That would be the Buffalo Point First Nation. On the matter of the involvement of other jurisdictions outside the borders of Manitoba, under the framework agreement, those First Nations that have ancestral lands outside these borders of Manitoba, whether it be in the province of Ontario or the province of Saskatchewan, there is a clause in the framework agreement where those First Nations can identify those lands. However, and here's where it gets tricky, and here's where it gets sticky, is that those neighboring provinces have to agree that those lands that were identified could become reserve, could be set apart as reserve by Canada. So unfortunately, to date, both jurisdictions have refused to engage in those types of discussions.
Which two jurisdictions were those that refused?
The province of Saskatchewan and the province of Ontario.
Okay. So in Ontario, it's with the Treaty 3 land?
Yes, yep.
Okay, that's interesting. And maybe you can comment on the fact that in northwestern Ontario, there's been a number of recent settlements, land settlement agreements. I went to one in Lac LaCroix. There's others in the works. They seem quite successful at coming up with land settlement agreements there. It sounds like you haven't had the same level of success under the Manitoba Treaty Land Entitlement Agreement. So in the end, do you think this has been a beneficial process, this agreement, or has it been detrimental to the communities involved?
Well, certainly 26 years ago, expectations were high. And for some of our member First Nations, they have put to good use their land entitlements, particularly those that have the ability to buy land in urban centers, such as the Sapatoya Cree Nation. They have purchased or acquired 3 parcels of land in the town of Swan River. 2 of those parcels are urban reserves. They do host 2 economic development ventures, one being a video lottery terminal club and a gas station. They more recently purchased a 3rd parcel, and so they do have plans there. So some First Nations have taken advantage of the opportunity under treaty land entitlement, no doubt. But I guess another point to consider is that for our more northern First Nations in Manitoba, they were not given the opportunity to buy land in urban centers. They weren't given land acquisition payments. They were restricted to selecting available Crown land. And I think I'd also point out that the one major difference between the Saskatchewan Framework Agreement and Manitoba's Framework Agreement is that in Saskatchewan, the First Nations were given money to buy all their land, whether it be Crown land or private land. But under the Manitoba Framework Agreement, only 6 of our First Nations were given land acquisition payments. So the northern communities were left out.
Okay, I turned to Jaime.
Thank you. And I'm hearing from the number treaties, and really thank you for your time. I want to ask, a lot of the misconception or the view in Canada is that the number treaties ceded away land during these treaty negotiations. Can you give me a sense if that's an accurate description of your understanding of the number treaties? And I'd like to start off with Ms. Cuthbertson and go to Mr. Blue Sky.
Thank you, MP Baptiste. My understanding as a treaty commissioner and from the research that we have in our office and publications and oral history, the other side of the treaties, is that treaties were not cede and surrender. The land was never meant to be surrendered. Cede and surrender clause was inserted at Treaty 3 after. If you look at any records from the treaty negotiations, which includes diaries, journal inserts, translations that were meticulously kept by translators such as clergy, Northwest Mounted Police, etc., there is the absence of the translation of cede and surrender. What you will find is cede and surrender inserted into text on the parchment that makes up the text of the treaties that Canada relies very heavily on for justification of taking up of land and resource development.
Thank you, Ms. Cuthbertson. Quickly, Mr. Blue Sky.
Yes, of course, we're in agreement with that. From our perspective, that the treaty number 1, which we're situated in here, we believe the actions that you currently see within our territory and some of the things that Chris had identified in terms of the interactions and consultations and accommodations that are currently happening with the Métis population within our territory. We feel that should have been the same process from the time of treaty whenever they started to develop our territory and our lands. That's why it's become so important for us to have lands returned to our communities and have the ability to economically develop them. But also the systems that are in place right now, I think if we would have, had this step and the process would have been happening from the time of treaty till now, we probably wouldn't be in a situation right now where we are in terms of being desperate for not only economic opportunities, but also the ability to feed our families.
Thank you very much, Chief Blue Sky. That is 6 minutes. We go now to the Bloc Québécois. Madame Gill.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being with us today and for giving us so much information about restitution. Since we started having these meetings, we've seen that, restitution can take different forms for each nation. For example, between the Métis and the Inuit, the First Nations, or if we're talking about modern treaties, numbered treaties. And it also depends on the place where you are. Chief Blue Sky was saying earlier that he's surrounded by other lands that are not Ojibwe lands. So I'd like to know, do you feel that despite all of these differences, it would be possible to have equity between every nation, be they Métis, Inuit, or First Nations? Because over time, with all of these discussions, things are very complex. So do you think that there can be equity, there can be fairness here, or do you think that there are changes that should be made to compensate for the complex process of restitution? And actually, I guess this question is for all of the witnesses who are with us today. Thank you. But perhaps we can start with Chief Blue Sky, if you want to start. Thanks.
I'm not sure if I was supposed to get a translation.
Yes, and on the bottom of your screen, there's the interpretation button. It looks like a bit of a globe, I think.
Okay.
And if you click that and click English.
Okay, I didn't.
All right, that was a
I heard my
2-minute
name
intro.
a few times.
I don't think I could sum it up as well as Madame Gill. So, Madame Gill, maybe you could do that really quickly back.
Ah oui, Madame Gill. Oui.
Yes, sorry. If I can just have a little bit of time to do it, of course, I'd be happy to do that. Of course, we always want to make sure that we can hear all of the languages that are spoken in committee. So just briefly, can you hear me, first of all, Chief Blue Sky? Great, okay, cool. So, you know, depending on whether we're talking about the Inuit, the Métis, First Nations, the question of restitution can be different and can take different forms. And of course, it can also be different based on the treaty, whether it's a numbered treaty, a modern treaty. So the process is very complex. And I'm wondering if you believe, and this is for all of the witnesses, whether you believe that it is possible to achieve fairness, to achieve equity between all of the nations and communities when it comes to restitution. And do you think that there will be more treaties signed? Or do you think that there need to be any changes made to the process? I wasn't able to re-ask the question very briefly, Chair. Sorry about that, but I'll let the witnesses answer, starting with Chief Blue Sky.
Yeah, again, sorry about that. I number one, I'm uncertain the strategy that Canada has to address this issue. Currently, when it comes to our land claim and our implementation of our land claim, and it also depending on and the territory, it also depends on the value of those lands as well in terms of who's all involved. When it comes to other Aboriginal groups or Indigenous groups, my issue is that Canada hasn't been clear as to how they plan on dealing with that. I can only say for number one is that, you know, our agreement was signed in 1997. We initiated those discussions in 1970s. Prior to that, and just for a little fun fact for the group here, Broken and Ojibwe Nation had their first additions to reserve. You know, we signed treaty in 1871. We had our first ATR in 1874, which was a lot less complicated back then, but we still had it happen. There was no consultation of any other group other than our own. But with that being said, I think that it's a challenging question for me to be asked directly, given the fact that the responsibility that question should be answered by Canada, quite frankly, as to how do they see it being a fair process, seeing that we've already had our agreements in place, and now these issues that are being brought forward today are not issues that we had brought forward. It was issues that the Canada has created. So for us, and in terms of the former Kapyong Barracks, it's a very important piece of property. That consultation with the other groups lasted almost 2 years of our time. So again, it's very challenging. A lot of things happen in 2 years, and especially development that is taken away from ours now.
Okay, Madame Gill, you do still have about 20 seconds, but that's not including the time you lost, so you probably have a lot more than that.
C'est passé.
I don't think that's enough. Well, actually, maybe I'll just ask the same question to the same witnesses, Mr. Chair. Maybe Ms. Culbertson would want to answer.
Monsieur Anderson. Merci.
Madame, Ms. Culbertson? Can you hear us? I think so. Yep, there you go.
Yes, I can.
Did you hear the question by any chance from Madame Gill?
I did not hear any of the translation, no.
Oh, no. Okay, that's okay. Well, I guess it's not okay. Madame Gill, do you want to quickly summarize again?
Je vais faire un miracle, Monsieur le Président.
I'm going to perform a miracle and do this in 10 seconds, Mr. Chair.
Can you hear now?
Yes, sir.
Can you hear Ms. Gill?
Can you hear the interpretation?
No.
No, okay. Do you see on your screen at the bottom, there's a little globe-looking thing that says interpretation or language, maybe? Right at the bottom?
Yes.
Okay, click that, and you should have another menu come up, and it should have two options, maybe three options.
We're losing our hard stuff.
Do you see it now?
I do, but then what happens after you click on it?
Oh, then you should be able to hear it. Now I'll get Miss Gill to speak in French here, because mine is horrible. I doubt the interpreters will know what I'm saying, and see if it works.
Testing, testing. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we're just testing if Ms. Culbertson can hear the English interpreter now.
Yes, I can now. Oui.
Great. Okay, so my question, I'll make it short, but I want to know if you feel that the process, the restitution process, is fair to all Indigenous groups and all nations, and if not, what needs to be changed to make sure that it can be fair?
Thank you for the question, and my apologies for the translation missing that. That's a very big question, but it is one that Canada should definitely be answering. I believe there's too many processes put in place, and the land restitution process right now is not equal. Like Chief Blue Sky had stated, they had an ATR in 1874, and it was quite easy. But now you have a process that was put in place that is so onerous, many nations do not have capacity because of inadequately being funded, because of inadequate training, and lack of capacity of human resources. So you have this ATR process where we have, in Saskatchewan in particular, First Nations who bought treaty land entitlement 30 years ago, and still that land is not reserve status. I believe, as a treaty commissioner, that those processes that were put in place in order to make it difficult for nations to be able to acquire land that they were entitled to by treaty is a continued breach of treaty. And it's discriminatory, and it was put in there on purpose. The land restitution is not equal when you have these processes in place to begin with, and when you have other treaties, modern agreements, and other constructive arrangements being negotiated around all the Indigenous people. And not to mention, which a whole another standing committee should be looking at, is the access to the lands and resources that are being sold off in Crown land auctions, access to the land and resources that are underneath the existing lands here, and the equity when it comes to resource extraction and who's benefiting from those resources. So no, the land restitution process currently is not fair. You're pitting Indigenous people against Indigenous people now by these agreements where you have, our Métis brothers and sisters and our First Nations going to be at each other's throats over land.
Okay.
And Canada's the one that's holding all the purse strings.
Thank you very much, Ms. Culbertson. Thank you, Ms. Gill. Sorry, all of that, but yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to each of the witnesses for your presentations. I have one question for each of you. First, Mary, and then Chief Gordon, and your colleague, as well as Chris Henderson being the last. What would be your recommendation? As we all know, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples these rights need to be recognized within Canada. So I have a question for you. Would you suggest a recommendation how we can recognize Indigenous rights even more? Mary, if you can start first.
Sorry about that. Could you repeat, MP, the last part?
The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples need to be recognized even more so in Canada. And this declaration, how could we utilize this declaration even more in regards to the restitution of lands?
How can this instrument be used?
The UN Declaration and the Implementation Act that's currently there's an interim, I believe the final report being released, supposed to be this month, and that's the UN Declaration Act. To implement the UN Declaration fully on the rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada, all Canadian laws need to be completely compatible with that UN Declaration. And Canada's laws cannot override those base set of standards that the UN Declaration sets out. I remember when I first read the UN Declaration, I was in law school at 2009, and I remember looking at it thinking, well, wow, why didn't we just have this all along and there'd be no issues? Right? All our treaties would have been honored. We would have a right to practice and exercise all our rights inherently, and the right to self-determination recognized. Canada needs to ensure that its laws are changed to make compatible with the UN Declaration. And that means complete overhaul of laws. But we know that Canada is there for Canada. Canada is not here to protect all the rights of Indigenous peoples. If that was the case, there would be no Canada, because the Indigenous peoples wouldn't have allowed it. They wouldn't have allowed such blatant, yeah, you can come here and you can have all our land and you can put us on reserves and you can put us in residential schools. You can put policy in place to starve us, commit genocide, and then we're all good. So colonization, what created Canada, what created all the countries that have Indigenous people and that now have outside governments running them, those were made in the name of empire building. Not let's go out and protect Indigenous people and lands. So we have this law structure, Canadian law structure, that's completely incompatible with the UN Declaration. It needs to be made compatible. And all these processes that Canada has put in place, and the provinces, those need to be eradicated, because none of these structures, processes, legislations are there to protect Indigenous people and the lands. Because the purpose of exploration here was to get to the lands. So there is a lot of work to do. And I do not believe there'll ever be 100% reconciliation, because 100% reconciliation is implementation of treaty obligations, and it's allowing nations to have full self-determination over their lands and themselves. So there is a lot of work to do. And I do not believe I'll be able to see it in my lifetime. I sure wish that was different, but I don't believe that's so.
Thank you. And to Chief Gordon Blue Sky.
I really appreciate it. And I also just want to acknowledge your beautiful language and native tongue. It's a wonderful thing to hear in 2023. And I wish all of our nations were afforded the same when speaking at these levels. But with that being said, for me, I think the first step is exactly that, recognizing our people. The Declaration itself, if you look at the Declaration of Human Rights, when that happened, what happened? What was the subsequent actions from there? There was the creation of the Human Rights Commission. Then there was the Human Rights Tribunal, where you can actually go and make arguments on issues specific to human rights. Indigenous rights aren't being treated the same. We are being left to fight these things out in these courts, where only real change that we can actually have is all the way up to the Supreme Court. But yet human rights are being challenged and recognized, and decisions like what we're seeing today in regards to our children are happening today in real time. So I think that the steps that need to happen is that there needs to be an Indigenous Rights Commission that allows for us to have tribunal and to have decisions being made that recognize the issues that we have here, because there's no courts that are supporting that right now. The courts that are being supported right now are the system that we're involved with right now. We didn't have any involvement in creating. So if we had no involvement in creating that, how are we expecting that our issues and rights to be settled within a structure that was never meant to service our people? So for me, it's a big challenge that where we are, we've all inherited this. Everyone sitting around this table, everybody online inherited the problem that was created over 200 years ago when it started to, recognize the immigration of people into our territory, but then the push of us and the annihilation of our people away. So I think if Canada was to get serious, they would start to look at having opportunities for our people to sit down and be able to discuss disputes and be able to discuss Indigenous issues that aren't contrary to law, but are focused on the Indigenous rights that we have inherently from birth.
Thank you very much, Chief Blue Sky, and to all our witnesses today. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time to hear from more witnesses, but like I said in the first panel, if you have anything more to add, please feel free to submit that in written form to our committee, and we will definitely take that into consideration when we draft our final report. Thank you to all our witnesses once again. Thank you to our panelists. Our next meeting will be on Monday, June the 19th, where we will be discussing, yes, the Whitecap Dakota agreement. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you in a few days. Good job, everyone. Thank you.